Hey there everyone, Jeremy Siskind here. I'm the author of Jazz Piano Fundamentals. This is Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 2. There's 3 volumes. One is months 1 through 6 of studying jazz. This one is months 6 through 12. And the other one is not months at all, it's all about modal jazz. Also the author of Playing Solo Jazz Piano Fundamentals, Book 1, the aforementioned, and the book Solo Standards for Piano. This is volume 1. Someday there will be a volume 2. Subscribe to the email list if you haven't already. It's in the video description. All right. Today's task is to talk about scale patterns, and the title of the video is something manipulative. Of course, it's YouTube. Like the best scale patterns aren't using all notes from the scale, and that's not only manipulative; it is true. And I want to show you an interesting example. But first, let's talk about what a scale pattern is. I do come across a lot of jazz students and somewhat experienced jazz students who don't really do scale patterns, and I think they're really important. So in terms of, say, transposing exercises or rote exercises, we have licks, right? A lick is a finite phrase. I teach some licks on the channel and other places. Right, and you take that and you learn it in every key. So that when that progression comes, you can plug it in. A scale pattern is a way, it's not finite exactly, it's a way of manipulating a scale so that when you improvise based on a scale, you've got more to do than just play up and down, right? We want to get to know our scales super well. So we might take our C major scale. Let's see if I think this works up here. And we might divide it into, let's say, thirds. So instead of playing, I'm going to play staying completely within the scale, but not just playing the scale up and down. Or another really popular and let's say important scale pattern would be triads. Right? And one thing that I tell people about scale patterns is what you want to do is you put the note of the scale on the beat, and then whatever you're adding to it, you're going to put in between. So, for the triads, I'm thinking duh, duh. These are on the beat, and then I'm putting the triads above, in triplets in this case, or maybe a leap down and then steps up. Let's see. I'm doing so bad. We're going to do a third down and then steps up. All right, so the notes of the scale are still on the beat. And I guess I'm imagining these other ones being 16th notes. Now, there's this great passage from this Hank Mobley solo. This is a solo on If I Should Lose You. One solo that, by the way, is a transcription project in Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 2. There's, I think, 5 transcription projects in there and 6 in Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 3. But I'm fascinated by this part. So let's take a look at this first. Okay, so let's get rid of these last couple notes. They don't really count. So what he's doing here is a scale pattern. He's playing his main note. Here he's playing at every half note. And then he's doing his third down and back up. Now, those of you who are very wise are wondering what scale it is. And I would say that he's switching scales. That's how I would personally analyze this. You could make another argument, I'm sure. But like here he's thinking about some sort of a D minor scale. We don't really know whether it's melodic, harmonic, Dorian, whatever. And then here we're doing a B flat major scale, or we could think C Dorian, F mixolydian. right? But just for argument's sake, let's pretend that I was going to take a B flat major scale and do that pattern all the way. I could absolutely do it both up and down. And then here's how Hank does it, going down. Right. But now here's the cool part, which is that the first half of this phrase is also a scale pattern. So you can see he's going up every half note. And then the second half, he's just going down. So like this is one of the most exercisey parts of a brilliant solo that you'll ever see. Now, some of you might be wondering, what scale is he using? And here's where the title of this video comes in. Because, again, he's using some kind of a D minor scale. Maybe it's harmonic minor. We're not exactly sure. But you might notice there's some notes that wouldn't belong to that scale, particularly this D sharp here. Why are these notes here? Because we're using a chromatic lower neighbor as part of the scale pattern. So this pattern is, let's say, main note, right? The main note that we're playing in the scale, lower chromatic neighbor, I'm writing as LCN. Main note again, and then third up. So without the chromatic lower neighbor, it sounds a lot like the version of the one that's going down, but then he just makes it a little more colorful. And so what I want to share with you today is that as you're practicing your own scale patterns, I would really suggest not simply practicing scale patterns that stay completely within a scale, but using some scale patterns that also involve non-chord tones. So we're going to talk about it. You can actually find some of these scale patterns using non-chord tones in Units 7 and 8 of Jazz Piano Fundamentals book number 2. And the first one I nicknamed the Joy Spring pattern. And this is one of my favorite patterns to practice and to show students. And the way that this works is that you're going to have descending triads within the scale. So we already talked about triads within the scale. So let's take C major. Right? And then before each triad, you're going to put a chromatic lower neighbor. Now, chromatic means by half step, and this note might be in the scale. Like you could see E and B are the chromatic lower neighbors of F and C, respectively. Or, like the rest of them that have sharps, it might be outside of the scale. So we have... right? And this is especially notable because we're putting the chromatic note on the beat, right? Which means we're getting this accenting chromatic lower neighbor. By the way, why do I call this the Joy Spring pattern? The very end of Clifford Brown's solo on Joy Spring goes... So he uses that pattern in here. And I also have some other ideas in this book of how we might be able to use chromatic neighbors and combine them with triads, like going up. Right, and you can see the melodic minors here as well. We're just going to stick with the major for now. And if you want to get really fancy, you could do the same thing with a seventh chord. So I'm putting a chromatic lower neighbor in front of the first note of a seventh chord arpeggio. This is such good practice. You're getting these big open hand positions. You're working your fourth and fifth finger as you're doing those chromatic neighbors. And you're really reinforcing the non-chord tones and chord tones. And same thing, we could go ascending. And please, 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 if you practice this, use 2-1 for the first two fingerings here. I know it's really tempting. There's 5 notes, you have 5 fingers, but boy, is your hand going to be hurting, and you're going to feel very awkward if you try to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, I didn't write this in the book, but hey, we're here. I want to make you feel special. You could also do this with a chromatic enclosure. Right, so I'm still I'm thinking about these notes. Terrible demonstration. And now instead of just a chromatic lower neighbor, I'm going a half step above, then a half step below, then playing the target note. In that case, I would probably think of the main notes as being on the beats. Now, I told you there were also there were also these kind of patterns in Unit 8. So what do we have here in Unit 8? Well, I have this lick. I've taught it once on the channel before, so if this sounds repetitive, maybe it is. But a really great lick to play and to practice called the Yodel lick, which is basically we're doing sixths, right? Each note of the scale, I'm going up a sixth and then coming back. And then I'm just trying to set up the next note. Now, what makes this so fascinating is that because sometimes notes are a whole step away from each other in a scale, and sometimes notes are a half step away from each other in a scale, we have to learn how to set them up differently. So you might notice that in the text, I've labeled some as just using a chromatic neighbor. And others, when it's a half step, will set up using a chromatic enclosure. So depending on the place in the scale, you're going to have to learn how to set these things up a little bit differently, which is a really good skill. Here's another beautiful and really important scale pattern that uses non-chord tones. I call it the Rondo alla turca lick, right? If you've ever heard this Mozart piece. That's what it's named after. And it teaches you this principle of using a diatonic upper neighbor and then a chromatic lower neighbor to surround an important note. Now, is this really a scale pattern? Maybe technically it's an arpeggio pattern, which is a thing I just made up right now. Because I recommend only practicing in these enclosures around the root, third, and fifth. Whereas usually in a scale, like I showed you, I would put each note of the scale successively on the beat. But a great one to practice using non-chord tones. And you could see, I'll play this for you. I have a little example of how we would apply some of these to a blues, and you can see how nice it is to practice using non-chord tones in context. So, 1, 2. Okay, I made up my ending a little bit. But if you could follow along, you see we're using the lower neighbor plus triad, lower neighbor plus seventh chord, the Rondo alla turca lick, and the Yodel lick all in there. And it's very, very colorful over this blues progression. Okay? So the beautiful thing about scale patterns as you practice them is that, first of all, My students, I tell them to play a scale, and they're always going right from one note of the scale to the next note of the scale. So scale patterns give you other options of how do I use a scale, but make it sound interesting. Secondly, you can use as much or as little of it as you want, right? A lick, we usually play the entire lick. A scale pattern, I could just use for 1 beat, 2 beats, 3 beats, and then kind of go off of it. So you can integrate it. You can think of it like a building block. And then thirdly, as we discovered today, you can integrate non-chord tones right into your scale patterns. So if this seemed like a great lesson for you and this seemed like a great level, Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 2 might be a great book. And this is chock full of scale patterns. Every single unit has its own little scale pattern instead of like Book 1 has a lick every unit. So check it out. Yeah, if you've watched this far, say something about the word pattern and we'll see what you come up with. Thanks for watching, everybody.